Hello, welcome to another episode of Debatable with your hosts Nina and Kyle. I'm Nina.
I'm Kyle. Today we're going to be talking about every new debater's worst fear: how to first speaker.
Ooh.
We're doing this topic for a few reasons. The first one is that we feel like first speakers are very underrated by judges, especially.
Yeah.
And this leads to it being underrated by debaters as well.
It's an unpopular choice when you enter debate. Often you'll fear being assigned to do first speaker, or you'll always want to be whip or a deputy. You're afraid of the prep time. You're afraid of being the first 7 minutes. And we just think it's kind of sad that no one steps up to be a first speaker as often as they used to, or as often as the community might need it.
Yes, because Nina is a very good first speaker, and she's been first speaking for me for years. And I have also first speakered for a good number of years, like almost half a decade.
That's a pretty good number, I think. Yes, so the first thing we want to do with this topic is to debunk some misconceptions that people may have about being a first speaker. The first misconception is that first speakers are weak, which is just not true. I think it's very odd for people to label first speakers as weak when they are literally the individuals who paint the entirety of what the round will look like. I think there's a lot of power in being a first speaker. I think it's wrong that people look down on first speakers. And if you're a first speaker, you should be very proud of it. There's a lot of unique skill sets that you need. A lot of very intuitive and sharp arguments that are required in order to run this role properly. So no, you're not weak. People just think you're weak and they're the problem.
The second misconception is that it's just really boring because it's just all the basic stuff, but it's the basic stuff that makes everything good. Just because it's the basic stuff doesn't mean you have to stay basic. You can be sophisticated in your discussion of basic principles, which is what Nina and I love trying to do. We try to use classic arguments at first speaker and we put like our own twists into them. So no, it's not boring. It's only boring if you think it's boring and you don't want to put in a lot of effort into it. If you want to put in a lot of effort into it, it's really interesting. It's actually really full of adrenaline, actually, because you only have 15 minutes or maybe 30 minutes to essentially paint an entire world from scratch.
Yeah. And the last misconception is that first speakers just need to be clear. As we've already discussed, that's a lie. There's a lot of practice, there's a lot of skills that come into being a first speaker. Being clear is important, yes. But I don't think that's the only trait of a first speaker. If anything, being clear should be a skill of every single person in the round. Just because you're messy doesn't excuse you from not trying to be a first speaker. So no, you don't just need to be clear. No, it's not boring. And no, first speakers aren't weak. The second part that we want to do for this episode is to discuss what then should the mindset of a first speaker be.
First, I think the priority should be that you want to be as broad as possible. And the reason for that is because, as I said, you're literally creating a world from scratch. And you want to make the picture as comprehensive, as detailed as possible, but still being strategic with how you use your time. So what Nina and I like to do is to use the lists method, where we have a single point that we look at the 3 levels. So we have 3 arguments with 3 sub-levels. So there are lists within lists. And it just helps really organize all these different points, so you have a more coherent picture at the end.
The second thing that we recommend a first speaker have in their mind all the time is the idea that they should always be the ones in control. So in prep, they should be leading what makes them comfortable. They should be the ones asking the questions if they're not sure about certain things. Because as a first speaker, you are literally the person who gets to speak first for your team. I mean, that's literally what it means. Which entails that you have a comprehensive understanding of your own case. So don't forget you're in control, demand control if you seemingly lost it, and always ensure that you know what's happening at every step. The last mindset to have is to have the mindset of never being content. You always need to practice. And the skills of a prime minister aren't developed during the round itself. It's developed during case building. It's developed during trainings. It's developed during familiarizing yourselves with basic arguments that may pop up.
You're eventually going to figure out that most motions have very similar arguments with other motions. So it will come to a point where you just see a motion and then you're going to instinctively make these arguments, these frames, these context. This is the reason why Nina can finish a prime minister's speech in like 3 or 5 minutes. That's the reason why we both can think of arguments really, really quickly, just because of all the prep that we've already put in.
Yeah, so that's the mindset that we'd recommend the first speaker to have. The next part of this episode is to now dissect a PM speech. What should pop up in your 7 minutes? What should you focus on? What should the structure be? We'd say that the list is comprehensive and a list that you should try for yourself, but feel free to tweak it, feel free to experiment, because again, you're the one in control. And if this structure doesn't work for you, then fine. The first thing that every prime minister needs to have is
Quotable quote.
yes.
It just essentially has to be something that can be remembered, because I think, or it's just a personal thing, I really, really get so tired of so many people just saying, "We live in a world," or those types of introductions. And maybe try to be creative every once in a while.
You're so mean. But yes, I agree, despite how mean Kyle said. If you don't hook people in your first few seconds, you're not going to hook them for the rest of the 7. So it does matter. Though, again, this is just optional for some of you. For us, it's required. So obviously, the introduction doesn't just exist for being an introduction. It exists to paint a picture already. So oftentimes, when you make a frame or a context out of an introduction, you operate in medias res. Meaning that you assume that the debate is happening during the middle of all of it. So if the motion is about war, you assume that the war is currently happening. Or if it's about a struggle of a movement, you assume that you are in the middle of that struggle, in the middle of that controversy. It enables you to make better arguments, but also enables the audience to be captivated with what arguments you are about to present. The second part of a frame is the definitions. Though not all motions require you to define things, there are certain motions that may require you put a bit more effort in describing what they mean for the round itself.
Characterizing.
Yeah.
Because essentially what a frame is like a snapshot of the reality that you want to portray. Because reality is just so diverse, and you want to look at the parts of reality that are strategic for your side to show. Because there are also parts of reality that are strategic for the opposing side to show. So keep that in mind when you're talking about these characterizations, the context that you want to bring out in the debate.
Yeah, and the definitions that you want for the round. The second part of a prime minister's speech is the setup of a strategy. And if you listen to our episode 1, strategy is just comprised of things that you should have already prepped for. So what's the stance? What are the goals? What are the burdens that you end up wanting to fulfill? A lot of speeches don't explicitly do this, and that's fine, as long as the judge as well as the audience can actively track what you are about to do in your speech and what you want to achieve as a team, or what you'd want to achieve as a bench or in the whole debate. Then it makes it a lot easier for them to digest the next parts that follow.
I think just to be safe though, like better being safe than sorry, I think it should be explicit.
Yeah, I prefer it being but again, your preference. But I'd say that a lot of judges don't really see implicit strategies as well as they should at most times. So it's a shared fault. Maybe you're not clear enough, maybe the judge was listening enough. So better just be safe than sorry, like Kyle. The third part is the setup, which is, I think, the heart of every prime minister or every leader of opposition. How do you plan to approach the debate? So the first part of a setup is to set up important clarifications. What is the debate about? What is it not about? This is where you get rid of wrong definitions. This is where you get rid of non-issues, for example. Like the motion we prepped last episode. Like, this house believes that privileged allies something. So obviously, we are talking about the allies. We made a clarification that it's not about bigots, it's not about the members within the movement, it's about allies and people who are outside the movement who wish to support it. So clarifications like that become very important and very relevant and very useful to ensure that the debate is clean and that no team gets away with unfair strategies in the round.
The second is that you need to create a policy, and actually, not all debates are policy debates. Some debates are just value judgment debates. If it is a policy debate, there are a few things that you need to take into account. First, that it must be detailed. The second is that it should try to preempt a lot of things that will come from the opposing side in the form of safeguards or things like that. Third, that each level of the policy is a mini argument or a mini principle in themselves. And the reason for that is because you don't just create a policy for no reason. There's a reason why you make those prongs. So elucidate what those reasons are.
Wow.
And then finally, you have to keep in mind that the policy should adhere to the overall strategy that you're trying to create. So we actually created sort of a template or like a few guide questions for it. The first one is that the first level of the policy is basically just you saying what the motion wants you to say. So if the motion was, this house would create super soldiers for war, the first level of the policy is, we're going to create super soldiers for war. The second level of the policy is to talk about the institutional level of how the policy will work. So this is where all the details will come in. So in the case of the super soldiers motion, this is where you talk about things like consent. This is where you're going to talk about when they're going to be deployed. Will they be the first resort? Will they be the last resort? What kind of training will you have? The third part is to talk about the strongest principle that you have on your side and then make it into a prong just so that you have something tangible that your principle can adhere to. So in this case, the strongest principle I think for government would be ending the war really, really fast. So part of the policy could be that you're going to strategically utilize super soldiers to minimize casualties and make the war end faster. The fourth level is to take the opposing side's strongest principles and then try to preempt them and create safeguards. This is where, I think for this motion, if opposition will say something like,
the humanity of these soldiers are lost, or they are not able to revert back the life they once knew.
Yeah, so if that was the argument of op, this is where you talk about things like, oh, we're going to reverse it after they retire from service.
There's going to be like seminars afterwards to debrief them or to reduce any trauma that they might, stuff like that, right?
And then finally, this is optional, I think, but I just really like doing this because it rounds it up to a nice odd number at 5 levels. I almost always say that this is a debate about the principle behind the motion and not the specific technicalities. So we're also going to close loopholes, we're going to ban loopholes, we're going to make sure that nobody abuses the system, these kinds of things.
Yeah, because I feel like if the debate ends up devolving just focusing and nitpicking on the policy, you're not doing the motion justice. So if you're a first speaker, make that very clear that obviously no policy is absolutely perfect in real life. So we'd rather focus on the merits and demerits of actively trying to impose a policy like this, as opposed to the details that it entails.
Sometimes you might need counter props for opposition, and basically it's the same thing, but you just need to add a few things. Like, you can either agree with the problem of government and say their policy doesn't address it properly or their policy makes it worse. You can also talk about status quo if you like. If you think that is more strategic for your side. If that's the case, you also have to show why status quo is self-correcting or there is no problem. But then if you are forced or if you choose to create a counterprop, you can still use the same 5 levels for that policy.
Yeah, so frame and introduction, the strategy, and the setup. So these 3 parts, despite us spending so much time talking about them, they only comprise, let's say, 3 minutes of your entire PM. So they may seem like a lot of things, but they're not the chunk of what your speech is supposed to be. They're just meant to be like an intro or meant to be a short setup before you dive into part 4, which is the arguments. So as we've discussed and showed you before, there are so many ways to build arguments. You can utilize different concepts, different frames, different ideas that you may have learned for yourself or learned in other rounds, and we'll go into more detail as to how to build arguments in the future. But for now, all you need to know as a prime minister or as a leader of opposition is that your arguments usually comprise of the intuitive things that like an average reasonable individual who does not debate would have thought of for themselves. And there's usually 2 parts to this, or at least for me, all my prime minister speeches have two parts. I have a principle and a pragmatic. The principle being an analysis of values, the pragmatic being an analysis of possible outcomes and results. And these arguments as well, even if you're not a rebuttal speaker, if you're a prime minister, you should sort of preempt what arguments your opponent will say and rebut them already. Not explicitly, obviously, but you're going to assume the best case of opposition and try to curb around those arguments and curb around those details as early as possible. And you do this best if you are if you familiarize yourself with what opposition might run, or if you're just used to having a devil's advocate.
So I think that, as I said in a previous episode, arguments, while they comprise most of the speech, they're not the most important part. What I said before was that the most important thing was the strategy. And the reason for that is because if you have an argument without a strategy, even if it seems good by itself, if it doesn't solve the core problem of the debate, it's not gonna win you the debate. So the end of every argument should always be tying it back to the strategy, tying it back to the burden, tying it back to the goals of the debate. That's the reason why we spent 3 minutes of our speech setting up policy, the context.
So part 4.5. So besides arguments, if you're a leader of opposition now, obviously you also have a separate portion to discuss rebuttal. If you are very familiar with being a first speaker, you might prefer to just integrate the rebuttals into your arguments. If you're lucky enough, your arguments are direct responses to the arguments of the Prime Minister. But if not, then you have a separate portion dedicated to responses. And again, we'll go into more detail into this in another episode, but all you need to know for now is the two basic parts of a rebuttal. The first part showing that the argument of your opponent is not true, then you give sufficient reasons and context and matter to disprove their argumentation. And second is an even if argument. An even if argument is an argument that assumes that their argument is true, but you're still able to prove that that's not the best case scenario, or that your case is still eventually overall better than what they want to achieve in their side. So that's basically what you need to know for part 4, that it's basically the arguments and the rebuttals. So I don't think we have to spend that much time talking about this because it's not unique to a first speaker anyway. But of course, we'll go into detail some other time. And the last part now, after you've done all of that, every good prime minister or leader of opposition needs to learn how to tie things together nicely. And Kyle already mentioned this earlier, that you always have to refer back to the burden, refer back to the strategy, but that's not all.
That's not all. You also, aside from it being a recap, like siguro at the 7-minute mark, you say, so what did I talk about in my speech? But if you want to use the time more strategically, you can use this time to push a burden on your opponent. So if you now say, this is what I proved, now it is upon them to prove this other thing. So you're pushing them into a corner, because if they don't prove it, it looks like they're being dismissive. But if you time it right and you do it right, they're not going to be prepared for it, and it's going to mess up their entire strategy.
So that's how you make a really good, lasting impression as a first speaker. And it's really hard to do this. Remember, in a British parliamentary round, if you're Prime Minister, there's going to be 7 other speeches after yours. It's going to be very difficult to remember your speech if you don't do it properly, if you don't do it with finesse, if you don't do it with a lot of emphasis to why your case is important. So try to remember that the goal of a Prime Minister is to be relevant even after the round. So recap, what are the parts of a Prime Minister speech? There are 5. The first part is the frame and introduction. The second part is the strategy. The third part is the setup. The fourth part is the arguments and rebuttals, if necessary. And the fifth part is the conclusion, which is where you give a recap and a burden. So that's a dissection of the Prime Minister. There's more to being a Prime Minister than knowing the parts, however. It's also a game of persuasion. And having a good structure is one step, and it's a big step, we'd say. But you also need to leave an impression, as I mentioned. So how do you do that? This is the next part of what we want to discuss in this episode, which are miscellaneous tips and suggestions.
First, I think you need to have a sense of what the tone of your speech will be. So a lot of speakers are really, really funny, But there are some times that when they give their speech, it's not as effective because the side that they're defending is about really, really sad things and they try to make jokes about it.
Yeah.
So there's sort of this tonal dissonance that you create. So you also need to take a look at what the motion calls for. What emotions should you have as a first speak? Because otherwise, it might sound off for the judge. But you can also make jokes. Like, I love making jokes. I feel like I'm just a frustrated stand-up comedian sometimes.
Yeah, I feel that. Especially during finals.
And the thing about that is, there are proper ways to introduce a joke. There are proper times. So if the priority of your speech at that point is to make fun, not in a mean way, but try to downplay the arguments of the other side, this is probably where you can make jokes. This is where you can probably sass. And don't be afraid to be sassy, because people will forgive you in the end.
I love being sassy. Being sassy is like my secondary nature in debate. I love it. I think people should take advantage. But it's also like very relieving to the judge as well, because they're probably tired of everyone being super serious. They'd want to hear a joke once in a while or a snark once in a while just to keep things light.
But on the other hand, if it is more your style to be really, really calm, that's okay. There are really, really good speakers that are just so calm. And the reason why they're so good to listen to is because the way in which they're speaking makes the entire speech clearer. Because there are also some tendencies where people just get so caught up.
I know that, Kyle.
I also know that. I was talking about myself.
Yes.
It is self-deprecating humor, Nina.
Yes.
So, if you have a particular speaking style, just be proud of it, because this is your time, essentially. So, my best advice would be to speak as if you were ranting inside your head, because everyone rants inside their head. That's the reason why people have alt accounts on Twitter.
Wow.
Yeah. So if you can manifest that externally, like it's not just in your head, and you should just harness that.
Yeah, I think it's very difficult if you try to make a very different persona when you speak. I think that some people try to do that they're very serious in real life and then they'll try to be funny. But given how different it is from their actual personality, not only is it unpersuasive, but it's also rather scary because it looks like they have two personalities at the same time. So try not to deviate so much from how you usually speak. How I talk in this podcast is how I speak in my debates. How Kyle goes off tangent in the podcast and gives jokes is also how he talks in his speech. So if you notice, we're not that different in different aspects or in different like speaking mediums.
Yeah.
If you don't want to do a persona, however, you can also try having spicy lines once in a while, or lines that are quotable, memorable, and lines that you think that people in the community will be talking about for a long time. Not in a bad way. Obviously, you don't want to commit equity violations or anything, but just make it such that people remember who you are, will remember what your speech was able to give, especially because you're able to condense it into one really, really nice sentence or paragraph. Yeah, I think that's it. We discussed misconceptions, the mindset of being a first speaker, parts, as well as other miscellaneous tips that might help you. So we hope you enjoyed this episode of Debatable. Again, I'm Nina.
I'm Kyle.
And we'll try to be updating every Friday from now on. We noticed, and I'm sure you noticed as well, that our uploading schedule hasn't been very consistent for the past few days. We're still trying to get a good feel of when the best time to upload is, and we're still trying to get used to meeting each other once a week to record. So now that we got a good system going, we're sure we'll be able to upload weekly every Friday. So we hope you're going to be able to join us then. We can't wait to talk about more nerdy debate things with you in the future, and we hope that you enjoyed this episode and future episodes to come. So thanks for watching. Bye bye. Oh, not watching. Thanks for listening. Bye bye.
Bye bye.